Okay, so we're being recorded now. Again, so this idea of looking at the interaction between various elements of society. Now, I think, I did mention this last week, but in case I didn't emphasize it enough, what he's talking about, of course, by interaction is not a harmonious interaction between things. It's not this idea that things just kind of fit together nicely or in a neat way. When he speaks of interaction, he's talking about interactions between things that causes tension and friction. And again, in an approach that is meant to bring out the contradictions of things, to show how things that seem to be incompatible with each other, in other words, in fact, are actually related to each other. So I think that's pretty much where we left off last class. I didn't get really a chance to talk about the proletariat or his comments on it in the essay, What is Orthodox Marxism? In this class, I'm mostly going to focus on the third essay, Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat, which I think is the most important part of the book. I'm mostly going to, I'm going to skip over then the essay on class consciousness. Probably won't get through the entire reification essay either, probably just the first part, denoted by Roman numeral 1, right? It's broken up into three different parts, 1, 2, and 3. Probably just get through that first part. But before I get to that, let me just, finish up talking about what I was saying last class. And of course, obviously, all these essays relate to each other. There are common themes that are elaborated in all three. So again, when he's talking about this idea of contradictions or the contradictions within capitalism, what is he basically talking about? Well, some of it we covered last class, right? This idea that even though the United States is the richest country in the world, the most capitalist country, you could say, in the world, it has numerous, economic and social dysfunctional aspects about it, some of which we covered last class, sort of elaborated in Chris Hedges's book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. Which, by the way, I also kind of glossed over the fact that his co-contributor on the book, Joe Sacco, is not a co-author, but actually an illustrator. And he's actually a very amazing artist. I totally forgot that to point that out last class. But he's a great, artist, illustrator, kind of pioneered the idea of what some people call comics journalism, and that he depicts sort of, non-fictional events, sort of goes, to different areas of the world. He's most known ever really for the graphic novel Palestine from the 1990s. Where he goes there and portrays the plight of the Palestinian people living under occupation there, kind of pioneered this idea of comics journalism. So very interesting artist to check out if you have time, or to check out the book itself, which I myself have not actually read, but it's definitely on my radar of something that I would like to read. So anyway, so they emphasize, again, the very early part of the book, many of the socially dysfunctional aspects of capitalism, which you would not expect, which I think is easy to say is a contradiction, things that you would not expect in the wealthiest country in the world. In the wealthiest country in the world, you should not expect all the various social dysfunctional aspects to be taking place. Of course, poverty, inequality, lack of access to food, lack of access to healthcare, a fairly sick population overall in many ways. But there are other, contradictory aspects that we can talk about as well. What would some of these other contradictions be? I mean, pretty big ones too. So what about the contradiction between democracy and capitalism? Right? I mean, that is a contradiction. The idea that we have a political system that it's supposed to be based on majoritarian principles, the rule of the majority, or the rule of the people, as the term democracy, literally means, coming from the Greek. So you have a political system based on that, and then you have an economic system that, basically favors the wealthy few at the expense of the many. That's a contradiction. These are things that would seemingly be incompatible with each other. And I should also point out that, of course, many people in the academic world in the United States and elsewhere have spent a lot of time trying to argue for the exact opposite, right? That in fact, capitalism and democracy do harmonize with each other, do go together, almost like they're, peanut butter and jelly or something like that, or peanut butter and chocolate, or, whatever, milk and cookies. I'll stop there. But I think you get the idea. Many people have made that argument. And we did talk a little bit last class about how economists are particularly, prone to this criticism of trying to quantify everything, of trying to abstract everything, something which Lukács is, essentially warning us about, right? And which this sort of dialectical approach is meant to be a solution to, right? A dialectical approach is meant to sort of overcome this sort of superficial isolation of things that we get when we reduce everything to numbers and make everything abstract. Economists obviously, fall very much prey to that kind of criticism, but, I don't think we should let political science entirely off the hook either. I don't know if many of you are political science majors. Maybe you are. I mean, this is a more advanced class. Maybe you're not. Maybe you're just fulfilling a requirement. But if you are, or if you have taken political science classes before, you might have noticed that political science, at least in the United States, is also very quantitative, very abstract. And that is something apparently that stands out, particularly among American political science. As it's been explained to me numerous times, even in Europe, political science there, the field of political science tends to be much more qualitative rather than quantitative, tends to, be more historically based. Whereas American political science is very quantitative, very much based on, crunching numbers and mathematical formulas and things like that. And that, I'm not like against numbers or anything like that, but maybe there's a sort of excessiveness to it or a tendency to sort of overuse that at the expense of, again, sort of coming up with a very sort of abstract view of reality and essentially being, disconnected from what is actually going on, from what's actually going on in the quote unquote real world. So that is something that, I think many academic fields, again, maybe particularly here in the United States, are prone to. A tendency to quantify everything, a tendency to reduce everything to numbers to the extent that you end up getting a very, kind of superficial view of things. So, we should not forget that economics is not the only, field of knowledge where that, critique could be applied to. Anyway, so, I was saying that in, reference to the tendency among political scientists to overcome or to sort of conceal, rather, the contradictory aspects of capitalism and democracy. The fact that these things should be somewhat incompatible with each other. What are some other contradictions I can bring up? What about the contradiction between empire and democracy? That's another one, another sort of glaringly obvious one that everyone should be aware of, yet most people seem to conceal or at least, just not pay a lot of attention to in some ways. The idea that we can be this sort of globe-spanning empire that exercises, military power in almost every corner of the world and somehow be a democratic government accountable to the, to the people of this country is a contradictory thing. Those are things that do not really go together, yet many people, like I said, kind of pretend that they do. And of course, this is, reflected, of course, in the massive expenditures on the military budget of this country, vastly, outstripping the, the funding that goes towards education and various other, social programs in the United States, but, providing various kinds of social benefits to people in the United States. And of course, what does this empire do? I mean, in many cases, we are, suppressing popular movements in other parts of the world. And if we're not, then, we're, or to the extent that we are, or even if we're not, we're supporting and many times, starting very unpopular wars for whatever, the reason that they're being fought, whether it's to, overthrow a democratically elected government or a dictatorship which probably in many cases we probably supported at some previous time, like Saddam Hussein or the Taliban. I say that unpopular wars. I mean, to a certain extent, anyone that's old enough to remember what it was like in this country in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq knows what a dismal time this was to be an American. And the fact of the matter is that these wars did have vast amounts of popular support. Certainly, the war in Afghanistan did, and the Iraq War maybe to a lesser extent, but still a good amount of popular support. That being said, that was a result of lies that were basically fed to the American public in order to justify those wars. And I think that once those lies were exposed, the wars became incredibly unpopular wars. And again, I guess that's the way in which these sort of contradictory elements are kind of held together. That you sort of have to come up with very convoluted means to take incompatible ideas like democracy and empire, or democracy and capitalism, and sort of find a way to kind of hold them together. Another contradictory element, and feel free to chime in if there's something else that you think of here, but I would say another one would be between our much talked about free market economy and the fact that the free market is basically kept alive on government life support at this point, and basically has been at least since 2008 with the financial crash. What do I mean by government life support? I mean government bailouts. I mean the Federal Reserve pumping literally trillions of dollars into financial markets to keep them going, near zero level interest rates to stimulate more spending and things like that. Various things which were devised as sort of emergency responses after the economic crash have now essentially become normalized. And that's essentially what I mean by the economy is basically kept alive on life support from the government. And if that support was withdrawn, the economy would quickly crash. Well, it doesn't really say much for the free market then. It has to be basically kept alive by the government. Isn't that what the free market means? Is that it's a sort of zone of human life that's sort of apart from the government, that is sort of free from government interference and things like that. Doesn't really say much for that. Jocelyn says, also interesting that capitalists such as Elon Musk denounce socialism when they've reaped the benefits of government aid in starting their own company. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And of course, that's true for many other people as well. Elon Musk is a good example. Many companies like Apple, not to mention many pharmaceutical companies, benefit from government research into technology, into pharmaceuticals, things like that, which they then essentially take for themselves, taxpayer funded research essentially, and then privatize it and then make money off of it, to the tune of billions and billions of dollars. I mean, Apple at this point is a $1 trillion company, right? I think it was the first company to be considered a $1 trillion company. I think quickly followed by Amazon maybe, and who knows what other ones have crossed that threshold at this point. I haven't really kept up with it, but yeah, I mean, and to a large extent, again, funded by taxpayer research, and if not for that, then exploiting loopholes so they don't have to pay taxes, as well as at least in the case of Apple, exploiting low wage labor in other countries like China. So yeah, I mean, that would be another contradictory aspect of it, that the champions of the free market, depend upon government support. Ralph Nader, calls this capitalism for the rich. No, I'm sorry, socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor. In other words, if you're rich, you live in this kind of socialist system where the government does help you out and benefit you and things like that. Whereas, if you're not part of the wealthy elite, you're subjected to this sort of brutal logic of the market where you got to prove your worth as a person. Somebody said, in an article I read recently, somebody says, that the idea that you have to earn a living to survive kind of implies that you don't really deserve to live, right? That, the idea that, if you don't do something productive or valuable, that essentially, you shouldn't be alive, basically. I'm probably, screwing it up a little bit, but I mean, it's an interesting idea. This idea that we have to earn a living, we have to literally earn our lives. Our lives aren't just something that have a self-evident, value to them. That we have to somehow justify our lives. We have to justify our right to be alive, essentially, is what they're saying. So I think there are various, contradictory elements within the capitalist system. Also, the fact that capitalism, although in its early phases, does lead to massive amounts of economic growth. As it develops more and more, it becomes unproductive. It increasingly becomes a kind of parasitic activity that sort of sucks the life out of more productive enterprises. And this actually is what really takes shape when finance becomes sort of the dominant mode of economic activity, as it has, in the United States and in other countries. That it no longer is this, much vaunted, highly touted, productive system that its defenders, frequently claim that it is. It is essentially in its early phases, but as it develops more and more, it actually becomes less productive. It actually becomes an impediment, a barrier to further productivity. So again, those are some of the contradictory aspects, I think you can say, of the American system, of American capitalism, and elsewhere. But I would say that these contradictions are significantly heightened and intense in the United States compared to a lot of other countries. They may exist elsewhere, but they are incredibly potent here within the United States. I think that's fair to say. And again, so this dialectical approach is meant to sort of bring out these contradictory elements, to sort of bring in, to create an awareness of them, basically, by looking at these things in interaction with each other. Okay, so that more or less, is what Lukács is talking about the dialectical method, which obviously is an important concept. And as we'll see, and as he does make some brief reference to in the essay, What is Orthodox Marxism? The purpose of a dialectical method is to help us overcome this problem of reification that he talks about, which I'll turn to shortly. But let me just say a little bit right here, since he does conclude the essay with the proletariat, and it does, figure significantly in his, other essay, the longer essay. I'm not sure if we'll get that much time to talk about it, but Lukács does have a lot to say about the proletariat, or, as is commonly known as the working class. And as we'll see, this is something that many people take for granted, right? Well, of course, when you talk about Marx, when you talk about Marxism, you're talking about the proletariat, the working class. Although, as we'll see, when we get to some of these later thinkers in the tradition of critical theory, they tend to move further and further away from the working class, to the point that they almost become anti-working class, strangely enough. And it is kind of hard to imagine Marxists who don't seem to have any real use for the working class. But we'll talk about that more in later classes, though it is a very important theme. Lukács, on the other hand, is very much in that older Marxist tradition, where he gives, very much, central importance to the role of the proletariat. So again, as he says here, again, this is from the end of what is Orthodox Marxism. He says it was necessary for the proletariat to be born for social reality to become fully conscious. The reason for this is that the discovery of the class outlook of the proletariat provided a vantage point from which to survey the whole of society. With the emergence of historical materialism, there arose the theory of the conditions for the liberation of the proletariat, and the doctrine of reality understood as the total process of social evolution. This was only possible because for the proletariat, the total knowledge of its class situation was a vital necessity, a matter of life and death, because its class situation becomes comprehensible only if the whole of society can be understood, and because this understanding is the inescapable precondition of its actions. Thus, the unity of theory and practice is only the reverse side of the social and historical position of the proletariat from its own point of view of self-knowledge coincides with knowledge of the whole, so that the proletariat is at one and the same time the subject and object of its own knowledge. So again, another fairly dense passage from Lukács. But basically what he's saying is that, you know, the sort of recipient of the Marxist dialectical approach is the proletariat, that it is for the benefit of the proletariat, basically, that this knowledge comes about. And, you know, again, going into Marxist theory, that you know, the proletariat is supposed to be the culmination of the class conflict that animates life, that animates society. And what is required then for the proletariat is to sort of, you know, attain what he would call in the next essay class consciousness, right? To attain an awareness of its situation, what it is, that the worker shouldn't just see themselves as an isolated worker, that they are in fact part of a class of people really throughout the whole world, and that, you know, make up the vast majority of the world, whose interests are more or less aligned, you know, maybe not exactly, but whose, you know, overall interests, let's say, or larger interests are more or less aligned with each other. And that, again, you know, the crucial importance then is to sort of, you know, allow for the proletariat to come to this sort of realization of things, what he refers to as the unity of theory and practice, that political action without some kind of, you know, understanding of the general picture of society is sort of doomed to failure, he would say. And only with this sort of, you know, theoretically informed awareness of where you are and where things are going, basically, can the proletariat finally sort of, you know, accomplish its goal of freeing itself, basically. All right, so that will then more or less serve as a segue into the next essay. So again, like I said, we're also basically, you know, skipping over the essay class consciousness. You know, the reasons for that is I think, you know, quite obviously, this is the most important essay in the whole book. Not to say that the others aren't. I mean, they do for the most part elaborate very similar themes. But the essay reification and the consciousness of the proletariat, I think quite obviously is the centerpiece of the whole book. It's the most recent of the essays written here. Again, this book was published in 1923. This essay is written in 1923. The other essays were basically written a few years prior to that. So this is essentially new original material that was completed, you know, for the publication of this book. Lukács, by the way, at the time, I kind of glossed over this as well, was living in Vienna, which he went to after the collapse of the Hungarian communist regime in 1919. You know, Lukács is kind of an interesting person in that he basically spent his entire life sort of orbiting around Central and Eastern Europe. As far as I know, never, you know, made it to Paris, never made it to London, certainly never made it to the United States. That's actually a very different trajectory he was on compared to the Frankfurt School theorists who we'll be looking at basically from this point on, you know, from next week on, who were, you know, German intellectuals in, you know, in and around the University of Frankfurt in Germany, who basically went west, you know, fled, many of them going to Paris and London before going to the United States. After the war, you know, many of them went back to Germany, some of them stayed in the United States. So kind of an interesting contrast there. Definitely a culture clash between these people and their, you know, assimilation into American culture. Lukács, like I said, follows a different path, right? He goes east instead of going west. So he was Hungarian by birth, mostly lived in the city of Budapest, which is the capital of Hungary. Again, like I said, for about 10 years, lives in Vienna after the fall of the Hungarian communist government. Lives in Berlin for a couple of years, goes to Moscow for a period of time, goes back to Berlin, leaves Berlin again after the Nazis take over, goes back to Moscow, lives there basically until the end of the war, then goes back to Budapest, where he, you know, mostly stays for the rest of his life. So, like I said, very much in this orbit of Eastern and Central Europe, basically throughout his entire life. Anyway, so this was written while he was living in Vienna at this time. So again, the concept or the term reification is what Lukács is most known for, what his greatest, contribution to political philosophy is. And it is, he mostly bases his theory on Marx's later works, especially Capital, which is, Marx's mature statement, articulation of his views, which most people know him from. Reification, the term reification itself comes from the Latin res facere, which literally means to make a thing. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about, prior to this idea that a capitalist society essentially turns everything into a thing. It sort of strips away the unique qualitative elements, the unique qualities of things, and sort of quantifies everything, reduces everything to a numerical value, which kind of imposes a kind of false equality on things, right? When you reduce everything to a number, you're, like I said, you're basically, stripping what makes the thing unique and imposing some kind of artificial category on it, or kind of abstract category upon it. And that is essentially what he's talking about in this essay. And he elaborates, how this happens basically through the process of producing commodities, which of course is regarded as the central part of the capitalist system. Interestingly enough, many of his arguments seem to anticipate Marx's concept of alienation, which we obviously talked about last week, as elaborated in the Paris manuscripts, otherwise known as the economic and philosophic manuscripts. Alexandria is asking, I might have interpreted this wrong, but when I was reading this section, what did Lukács mean when he talked about commodity in social settings? That it's becoming a part of humanity? Yeah, in a sense. I mean, I saw you talked about this in your discussion paper. Yeah, no, I think you have a pretty good understanding of it. I should also say, based upon reading people's assignments, I think this is a very dense text, but it does seem like, people are picking it up well, at least the essential parts of it, which is good, certainly good to see. But what he's really saying essentially is that people become commodities. The people are essentially, again, the sort of unique human qualities that make people human, especially their individual qualities, are essentially being stripped away from them, and they're becoming dehumanized to the extent that they are treated literally as if they are a commodity, literally as if they are an object that is sort of bought and sold on the marketplace. I mean, that is essentially what he's talking about. And aside from that, basically all institutions of society essentially become commodities as well, or become at least subordinated to the aspect, or at least become subordinated to the demands of commodity production. What is required in order to produce commodities for the marketplace. Every institution of society, from the family, and religion, and everything on up from there, essentially becomes hardwired or transformed basically into sort of benefiting this process of making commodities, which is essentially the same thing as saying the profit motive, that everything has to become profitable or has to somehow play a role in benefiting the profit motive, and everything that doesn't sort of falls to the wayside. I mean, that's essentially what he's talking about there by commodity. But I'll sort of elaborate a little bit more about the commodity as well, because obviously it is a central concept, in Marxist theory. But no, I think you have a good understanding of it. So what was I saying? So yeah, anyway, he seems to pretty much anticipate a lot of what Marx is talking about in his idea of alienation. Amazingly enough, Lukács did not have access to these writings though when he was writing this himself. Marx's writings on alienation were unknown at that time, and again would not really see the light until about a decade later. Actually, Lukács played a role in that as well, working at the Marx Engels Institute at that time. He was in Moscow at that time. As I mentioned, he had made a couple of trips there, one short trip and then a much longer trip lasting throughout the war, World War II. But actually played a role in transcribing these texts and sort of helping them see the light of day. But again, when he wrote this essay, did not know these things at that time. So it is kind of interesting that he seems to anticipate a lot of these ideas, despite not having access to the writings themselves. So again, like I said a moment ago, I mean, essentially the main question he's asking here, and again, and this of course is a question which concerned Marx and Engels as well as various other socialist thinkers from that time, is what happens when the commodity again becomes the dominant principle of society, or every aspect of society is basically transformed to accommodate the production of commodities, i.e. the profit motive. So to answer that question, of course, you have to understand what are commodities. So again, according to Marx, commodities contain both what he calls a use value. What is the actual use of these things? What is the actual utility of a good or service that is produced? And for something like clothing, it's quite obvious what the usefulness of clothing is, or food, or things like that. Some of them are quite obvious, some of them maybe less so. But a use value, again, refers to the qualities that these things have. And the other aspect of a commodity is that it has an exchange value, which basically is a quantity, which is basically expressed in numerical form, in the form of a price. Now, it's also true to say that you can make a distinction between the price of things and the value of things, but there are concepts that are very much related to each other. But again, use value refers to quality, exchange value refers to quantity. This theme of quality and quantity, we're going to see a lot, especially in Lukács' essay. And I think it is something that kind of stands out about, Marxism as an economic theory, which is somewhat distinct, I would say, from most other economic theories, in that it is a theory which seems to privilege quality over quantity, whereas of course most economic theories do the opposite, right? They reduce everything to numbers, they quantify everything, even things that probably should not be quantified, and again make everything very abstract in the process of doing that. But Marxism is a little bit different in that it tends to privilege quality over quantity, and I would say it's almost totally unique among economic theories, at least as far as I know, that it tends to resist that tendency to abstract everything, to make everything into an abstraction, which of course always takes you at least a step away from reality as it's actually lived and experienced when you again reduce everything to numbers. And of course this is displayed, I think, to a great extent in a capitalist society where everything is reduced to kind of numerical values. Everything is quantified, whether it's your credit score, your test scores, your grade point average, things like that. I mean even things that don't directly serve an economic purpose, or maybe only indirectly so. There is a very much a tendency to quantify everything. But I should also say that that's not unique necessarily to capitalist societies either, or at least Western capitalist societies. So I did kind of mention, but also sort of glossed over, that these writings were not exactly well received, right, by the Soviet authorities at this time. So much so that again, Lukács in the 1930s was basically forced to denounce his own views, literally probably under threat of execution, or at least implied threat, which he did. And I think, the question could be asked, well, why do they have such a hard time with this? I mean, he seems very critical of capitalism. Why should they, care that much about it? I think, the fairly obvious answer is, of course, because the Soviet Union was doing the same thing, right? They also quantify everything, right? They reduce everything to productivity output, right? And, how many tons of steel you've produced, and, like things like that. And you see that even today with people who, defend China, Everyone talks about, how much China's economy has grown. I'm talking about, not just people in, in the West or people who defend capitalism, but, people who are basically more or less, defend the Chinese government. And there are people like they're out there. You may not see them in, the mainstream of American society, but they are out there. And they also, say the same things. They talk about, how much China's economy has grown since the 1970s. They've eliminated extreme poverty, as they call it. Poverty, of course, defined by a quantitative value, by, how many people live on $2 a day or something like that. So if you're living on $2.10 a day, you're not considered extremely poor. Kyle, did you have your hand up, or was that a mistake? Sometimes people hit it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, I'm not sure why China is considered a communist country in the first place.
Yeah, good point.
They're more like a state capitalist society.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you can make that argument that they are more or less a capitalist country. You could also make that argument about the Soviet Union. I mean, Lenin himself referred to the Soviet Union as state capitalist back in the 1920s. I mean, well, that's why I said communist, and then I sort of took it back and said, Western capitalist countries. When I said that, I was thinking that, yes, you could think of China and the Soviet Union as kind of like a different kind of capitalism, state capitalism, authoritarian capitalism. Yeah, I mean, I would accept that argument as being correct, actually. But again, I mean that kind of plays to that point that they are basically doing the same thing. They're called communist countries because there is a political entity called the Communist Party that rules those countries. I mean, that much at least you can say, right? The Communist Party of China is the ruling entity within China. Whether or not it actually practices communism is a totally another point. And I think you're right to point that out, that it is actually more like what you'd call state capitalism. But most people identify these countries as being communist, so I just refer to it that way, as not to confuse people too much, I guess. But yeah, I think more accurately it probably should be called a state capitalist country. But again, like I said, that kind of speaks to the point that these countries basically do the same thing. They also quantify everything. They also reduce everything to a quantitative value. So I think that's probably what angered the Soviet authorities towards Lukács back in the 1930s, is that they're this argument that he's making hits a little too close to home for them, because they are essentially also doing the same thing. Okay, but again, back to this idea of the commodity, because it is kind of important. So commodities have a use value, as he says, and an exchange, as Marx says, a use value and an exchange value, quality and quantity. But what happens is that commodities are really, even though they have a use value, they're not produced primarily for their use, for their usefulness, but for their exchangeability, for their exchange value. And eventually what happens over time is that exchange value becomes sort of the predominant form that the commodity takes, and that commodities are produced more and more, not because they're useful, but because they have an exchange value. And as that system goes on more, the exchange values of things become increasingly distant and remote from whatever sort of underlying use they may actually have. Now, this leads to all sorts of dysfunctional aspects as well. In other words, what happens when you have a society that's produced where things are produced primarily for the purposes of exchange rather than use? Well, I think there are many aspects of it. Take, for example, fossil fuels. Now, if we think of fossil fuels in terms of their use value, they do have a use, but they're also, extremely harmful, right? If we actually look at what are the qualities of fossil fuels, they are extremely harmful to the environment. We all know this, obviously. But because of their exchange value, because the fact that they are extremely profitable and make a lot of money for people, for various corporations, they continue to be produced, even though we all know that they're extremely harmful. So I think that's one aspect of it. Housing. could be another aspect, right? So houses obviously have a use for them. NFTs, yes, perfect example. Yeah, I think that's very interesting too. So what we're living in now is an aspect of capitalism or capitalism. I mean, can you even try to explain NFTs? I mean, it like makes my mind melt every time I try to explain this, because it literally sounds like the dumbest thing ever. I mean, I can't imagine that people would buy these things, non-fungible tokens, right, is what it stands for. And it just sounds like the purest example of speculation I've ever heard, of people just buying nothing in the hopes that they can make a profit off of, that they can literally, yeah, and it is kind of like a pyramid scheme as well, and that you get in early, you buy these things, and your whole profit basically depends on finding someone who's an even bigger sucker that's willing to pay more money for these things. I mean, would you like to try to explain it? I mean that's my overview of it. It's so bizarre that I have a hard time even trying to explain it, though, other than that.
Wait, you're asking me to explain it?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to, if not,
So like what it is, or like the phenomena that's occurring?
Well, I think the phenomenon is basically just pure speculation, like I said. But what are the things themselves? They're basically like pictures,
So
right?
yeah, so apparently, I mean, now they've like tried to like make a justification, which doesn't really make any sense, but
Yeah.
basically it's digital artwork that's printed on the blockchain, so it's like identifiable.
Mhm.
But that's really the only thing that is identifiable, and that's it. But now I think I think your name is pronounced Jocelyn. You said it's a pyramid scheme, which basically that's what it is, because like they'll like pre-sell and they'll buy them, and then they'll like, you're buying things that are not real. And now they're making like NFTs of like actual artifacts. So like if you have like a vintage car or like a basketball and it's worth like $100,000, you'll have like an NFT of that now is worth like $500,000 for no reason, because a bunch of people said so. And I was watching somebody talk about this, and uh on Jimmy Fallon and Paris Hilton
Yeah.
actually talked about how they owned these like images of apes that are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in front of like a bunch of people, and they're like laughing about it, like, oh, we're in such an exclusive club. Like it's like absolutely insane that that occurred on television.
Yeah.
And nothing happened. Like there's no class consciousness at all.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is an example of society has gotten to such a point where, yeah, things are made which have no use value. I mean, there is literally no utility for these things at all, and it's become almost like pure exchange value. It's only based upon the sort of inflated, made up price of these things, which they then hope to bid up the pricing and sort of create demand for by going out there and talking about it and trying to pretend it's cool, I guess, or fashionable or something like that. And I don't know. I don't think this one is really working. It seems that there's a lot of pushback against this. It seems that people are realizing that this is like the most insane thing ever. But it is a very good example of how sort of crazy and dysfunctional basically our economic system has become. And isn't it, I mean, if you buy an NFT, you don't even, it's like usually like digital art, you don't own it, right? You don't actually own the thing. It's like a copy of the thing. And can't most of these things, can't you just get for free anyway? Couldn't you just like,
Yeah, so you could just like right click
right.
and the thing is, it's not even like these apes and like these artworks, it's not even real art. Like it's like
Right.
the same like main character with like a different hat, or like
Crappy
sunglasses.
art.
Like there's no art.
It's like, kind of shitty art too. But I mean, that's subjective, judgment call, I guess. But yeah, it's just the the craziest thing. And I'm glad people are aware of it. People are talking about it. So yeah, a very good example of thing that, something that has zero use value and is just basically just pure exchange value, something that's just created for the purpose of exchanging on the marketplace in the hopes of sort of, bidding up the price of it. And that is certainly a very dysfunctional aspect of it. And Jocelyn, I think, also posted a link to her video. You can check that out. I'll look at it after class. It's a very weird thing. It's so irrational. I literally have a hard time even trying to like wrap my head around it. But I think that more or less is a good description of it. But anyway, so let me talk about some other quickly dysfunctional aspects of it. So one of the very most disturbing tendencies, I think, of modern day life is the commodification of housing, right? The fact that houses, which clearly have a use value, but have become basically something that is another commodity that's exchanged. So Ryan is saying artwork in general is kind of irrational because there is no practical use for a painting or something. Yeah, that is true. But I mean, artwork isn't primarily produced for exchange either, right? It's produced for the utility of the art, the enjoyment that you get out of the art. These things have no real artistic value. I mean, they're not, produced to be used. They're produced purely for exchange and to sort of, create this kind of inflated value, which does seem very much reminiscent of a kind of, pyramid scheme. But again, going back to the idea of housing, yeah, I mean, so we all saw this happen. Well, I mean, most of us did. I don't know how old you were when the housing crash happened, but I mean, maybe you have some recollection of it. But that was very much brought upon by the commodification of housing. So housing obviously has a use for it. It provides, shelter for people, which they need to live, basically, for the most part. But what happens is that we have a situation where housing is not treated as a use value anymore. It becomes an exchange value. It becomes something that people use and exploit, basically, to make a profit off of. So much so that you have people, in the lead up to the housing crash, obviously, you have people giving out mortgages for houses to people who could not afford them. Even to this day, there's a lot of blame. People tend to blame more the people who got the mortgages rather than the people who were giving out the mortgages. And I would definitely say, most of the blame should fall on those people, because they knew what they were doing for the most part, and they knew that they would basically be able to sort of offload this debt onto somebody else, and they wouldn't have to deal with the fallout from it. But just it also, drastically inflated and exaggerated the value of housing, which of course, one of the consequences of that makes it very, hard to buy a house. Housing is of course very unaffordable for the most part, at least in this part of the country. Literally people are, moving out of state, moving down south, moving to Pennsylvania and things like that to buy up cheaper housing there. And you do have those people who do the house flipping thing and stuff like that, which is a clear example of people who are not buying a house because they want to use the house, literally to live in the house, but because they're hoping to make money off of it by selling it to somebody else. So that is definitely a very disturbing trend that we see here again, and very much played, was essentially the cause of the housing crash in 2008. Besides that, we have people, we hear all this talk now about a housing shortage, which again also bids up the price of housing, but we don't really have a housing shortage, or at least to say it is kind of an artificial shortage. Because what you have essentially are large amounts of housing, both actual houses and apartments and things like that, which are held by absentee landlords, which are held by people who are not living there or not even renting out the places, but just holding on to it, waiting for a moment where they can sell it to somebody else at an even higher price. So, for example, the economist Michael Hudson talks about if you survey the New York City skyline at nighttime, you can see vast sections of the city, apartment buildings and stuff are almost completely blacked out at nighttime. And that is essentially evidence of the unoccupied, again, absentee landlords, which own large amounts of housing, large amounts of apartments and things like that, but aren't even loaning it out or renting it out to anybody. So if we have a housing shortage, it's again, a sort of artificially created by the commodification of housing. The same thing goes for food, for that matter, too. I mean, there are many people in this country who are food insecure, who do not have proper access to food. Many more people who, again, cannot afford healthy food, as I mentioned, briefly last class. I mean, the United States has the highest obesity rate in the world, basically, or at least among, developed countries. And, like I said, it's a bit of a balance. I mean, to some extent, people are, responsible for what they eat and what they put into their bodies. But we also know that the system gives people incentives to eat, essentially crappy food. That if you want to eat something that's healthy, it definitely costs a lot more money, right? A cheeseburger is a lot cheaper than an Impossible Burger, a vegetarian thing. Things like that. Vegan chicken is more expensive than chicken nuggets. But again, for people who are just, literally, cannot afford to eat or are very, deprived of food, it's not because there's not enough food to go around. It's because people don't have the money to buy food. I mean, there's more than enough stuff out there. I mean, restaurants waste, tons and tons of food, tons of foodstuffs, every year. The amount of food that gets, wasted every year is probably more than enough to, feed people if that was directed towards them. Farmers are paid money by the government not to grow crops, to stabilize the price of things. Again, everything goes back to the profit motive. Everything goes back to keeping the price of things within a certain level. So if people go hungry, it's not because there's not enough food. It's because they don't have money to buy food. Same thing with housing. There's more than enough housing to provide shelter to people. But it's just that when you reduce everything to a commodity and attach a price tag to these things, it becomes unreachable, unobtainable to a lot of people. And the final example then will be financial products, finance itself. And this sort of, touches on the idea of NFTs to a certain extent, but most finance is almost pure exchange value. There is no underlying use value to a lot of these things. Marx himself refers to financial capital as fictitious capital. It's not real. It's not based on anything real. It's based on pure exchange value, pure abstraction, pure, sort of quantitative numbers that just sort of inflate themselves. So those are some examples, right? I want to sort of, move on because I'm spending a lot of time on this. But socialists want to produce use values or production for use. That's true. So obviously the idea is to get back to an economic system that actually produces useful things for people rather than things that are just profitable, regardless of what use they actually have, if they have a use, or if that use itself might be harmful. It might bring about lots of negative consequences. So oftentimes it becomes, common to speak of the commodification of blank, the commodification of housing, the commodification of healthcare, another disturbing, sickening quality of American life, right? The fact that we have a for-profit healthcare industry, right? Health, a person's health should not be looked upon as a source of profit for somebody else, but of course it is. Anyway, so the exchange value is determined in large part by the quantity of labor power that is spent on producing the product. So if exchange value is something separate from the use value of things, what determines that value? Basically by the amount of labor that is spent producing that product. So labor itself, again, as I've already said, basically becomes a commodity as well, or what Marx calls labor power, when it is exchanged for wages. So there is an exchange there. You exchange your labor power, your ability to work, in exchange for a wage. So that in itself is another commodity as well. So again, Marx elaborates, what is a commodity? So these are the opening paragraphs from Capital, chapter 1, right? Again, Marx's mature work. So Marx says the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. So pretty simple there. Many people often refer to the commodity as the sort of cellular level of capitalism. If you think of capitalism as a kind of organism, a complex organism, the commodities are essentially the cells which make up the capitalist organism, let's call it. A commodity is in the first place an object outside us, a thing that by its properties satisfies human wants of some sort or another. The nature of such wants, whether, for instance, they spring from the stomach or from fancy, makes no difference. Neither are we here concerned to know how the object satisfies these wants, whether directly as means of subsistence or indirectly as a means of production. So he's saying that basically, yeah, a commodity is just something that has an exchange value to it. Doesn't matter if it's something that we need or if it's a luxury. Doesn't matter if it's something that's consumed as a consumer good or is a kind of input, a sort of component of another piece of production. It simply matters that these things are made and that they are exchanged, and that again the exchange value tends to dominate. So he says the use values of commodities furnish the material for a special study, that of the commercial knowledge of commodities. Use values become a reality only by use or consumption. They also constitute the substance of all wealth, whatever may be the social form of that wealth. In the form of society we are about to consider, they are in addition the material depositories of exchange value. So again, what he's saying, like I already said, is that commodities start off at sort of a lower level of producing things that people actually need, things that are actually useful to people. But as it develops more, exchange value tends to predominate, and the usefulness of these things tends to fall by the wayside or become of secondary importance. What matters is how much you can exchange them for in the marketplace. In other words, how much you can profit from these things. All right, so let me move on here a little bit faster. So Lukács quotes this passage in his essay himself, but there's also an important part from Marx's Capital. He says, a commodity is therefore a mysterious thing, simply because in it the social character of men's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor, because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labor is presented to them as a social relation existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labor. This is the reason the products of labor become commodities, social things whose qualities are at the same time perceptible and imperceptible by the senses. It is only a definite social relation between men that assumes in their eyes the fantastic form of a relation between things. This is often referred to as the fetishism of commodities, or simply just commodity fetishism. And what he means by that, what is a fetish? Now, obviously, and nowadays when you hear the word fetish, you think of something of a sexual nature, a sexual fetish or something like that. I don't think in Marx's understanding of the term, the word fetish had that meaning yet. When he says fetish, he means basically like an object of worship. That's kind of sort of the original meaning of the word fetish. And he's saying, on the one hand, that people literally tend to like worship these objects. They attribute all this importance to them. But what he's also saying is that people, because of the abstractness of exchange value and the abstractness of the way in which commodities are produced, that people literally forget, or is concealed from them, the social relationship between the people that make these things and the people that are consuming these things. So it's a kind of a strange way to think about it, right? But the clothing that we're wearing, for example, that we have a social relationship to the people that make that clothing, but we forget about that relationship, right? We don't think about the people that made the clothing that we wear. We just think about the clothes themselves. And of course, in many cases, this is done to sort of obscure the exploitive character in which these things are made, right? In other words, we don't want to think about the people in sweatshops that are making these clothes. or the people that are making our cell phones, for example, or pretty much anything that are picking our lettuce and picking our produce and stuff like that. We just want to think about the things themselves. When you buy a diamond ring or something like that, you don't want to think about the children working in mines in Sierra Leone or wherever, who get all kinds of mistreatment from their employers. We just want to think about the pretty shiny stone by itself. So what he's saying is that because of the exchange process, because of the way it works, and because of its abstractness and the way in which people are removed and distant from the process of production, that's easy for people to sort of forget about the social relationships that exist, again, between the people who make these things and between the people who actually consume these things. Interestingly enough, Jocelyn's saying here, also with animal products, again, another perfect example, factory farming and stuff. Also with animal products, some food like chicken breast has been marketed and made so indistinguishable from the actual animal that we don't picture a real chicken. Yeah, I've heard that, like, was it like KFC, like they grow their own modified chickens that are like, I don't know, like they don't have like heads or something like that. Like they're just like alpha chicken. Yeah, I mean there are all sorts of like, horrible conditions. Yeah, I mean if we knew, if we could actually see the animals that are being, processed for food and the conditions under which that took place, it would probably literally make all of us, throw up. I mean, it's so gross. And not to say the horrible conditions that the human workers go through there as well, who are of course, exposed to all this stuff. Incidentally, Elon Musk, who, we mentioned before briefly, is a trust fund baby. He's a guy that, inherited his wealth from his father, like so many other people, so many other wealthy people. As it happens, his father owned a mining company in Africa. I forget which country in Africa, but
South Africa.
I'm sorry, South Africa.
You're talking about Elon Musk?
Yeah.
Yeah, South that they owned an emerald mine in South Africa.
Right. I mean, is there an industry that screams out human rights abuses more than, a mining company in Africa? Where, I mean, the blood diamonds that come out of Sierra Leone and, places like that. I mean, just research, how employees are treated there. They get their arms cut off if they're caught, stealing and things like that. So that's, basically where his wealth comes from. And I don't know the exact circumstances. I'm sure his father was a very nice emerald miner and, whatever else. But it is interesting to check out if you're curious. All right, so we're almost running out of time here. So let me move a little bit faster. I don't know how we spent so much time and we didn't even get to the essay itself. But again, the idea of the commodity sort of underlies everything that Lukács is talking about. So if you at least understand this, I think it will help you understand the Lukács essay better. But and like I already said, it's a very dense text. I mean, I won't hold it against anyone if you didn't make it all the way through it. It is a lot to read. Most of the other readings, I think, will be somewhat shorter. This was a somewhat of a longer reading as well. But anyway, this is more based on Marx again. So where do profits come from? So profits come from the exchange of commodities, but how exactly is that profit created? And we know that the value of something or its exchange value is in large part determined by the amount of labor that is spent on it. So again, according to Marx, profits come from the difference between what the worker is paid and the actual value of what they produce. In other words, the worker is paid less than the value of what they produce. And that is essentially where profits come from. The workers will always be paid less than what they're actually doing, that the value of their work always exceeds what they're actually receive as a wage. This extra value that is appropriated by the capitalist is what Marx calls surplus value, and is basically how profits are generated. The value of labor power, labor as a commodity, is equal to the cost of producing a worker, food, shelter, etc. Now, again, now already that sounds very much like a dehumanizing thing, and it is, of course. But you probably could, like figure that out. You could probably figure out, how much rent costs over the course of a year, how much, food costs over the course of a year, or at least over the course of a month, and then just sort of, break it down week by week, day by day, hour by hour. And you could sort of make a calculation of that. And that is essentially what the worker receives. That is what their wages are, basically just enough to keep them alive, especially during Marx's day, especially during the 19th century, where people were working, 12 hours a day, 6-7 days a week, just enough basically to keep them alive for a long enough period of time that a new, fresh supply of workers can sort of take their place. So, yeah, and of course, many economists before Marx talked about this as well. This is often referred to as the labor theory of value, although Marx's take on it is a little bit different. The labor theory of value is often considered, to be a theory that has been disproven, and its original formulation it is. But Marx has a different take on it, which I don't think anyone has been able to really address or criticize as of yet. So what Marx does here, what makes him different, is that he makes a further distinction between labor power, the commodity, which again is quantitative. It is based upon the number of hours a person works in a day, from the qualitative aspects of actual labor, of real labor. And it's this abstraction from real labor that makes it possible to pay the worker less than the value of what they produce. So when you reduce labor to a commodity that's basically paid out over what you make over the course of a period of time, over a certain number of hours a day, that abstraction from what the person's actually doing makes it possible for them to receive less than what they actually are. Because again, some workers are going to work harder, right? Some, not everyone. So you have a certain amount of workers, they're all paid the same amount of money, but their work isn't all going to be the same, right? Some are going to be working a little bit harder than others. Some are going to do their work a little bit better than others, but they don't get any extra money from it. They don't receive more for their labor. They're all basically paid the same rate. And it's that extra amount that they're doing, or is this, again, abstraction from actual real labor, from the qualitative, again, to the quantitative, that makes it possible to pay them less than what they actually produce. So I think, yeah, from there, I'll sort of move on with the time we have left, which is much time. Keep in mind, I'm trying to summarize a 1,000-page book in just a couple of slides on a PowerPoint. So, I can only cover so much of it. Certainly read up more if you haven't. Certainly read Marx's Capital if you haven't read it. Again, this is pretty much what Lukács bases his argument on, of his readings of Marx's Capital. If you go to the Marxist.org website, right, which is the same website where the Lukács reading is taken from. If you go to just Marxist.org, there is an encyclopedia section which you can go to and read up on these things, on capital, on commodities, and things like that, which I recommend people doing. But again, I already mentioned this theme of quantity over quality plays a very sort of important role in Lukács' thinking. So, as he says here, this is from the first section of reification and the consciousness of the proletariat. He says, if we follow the path taken by labor in its development from the handicrafts via cooperation and manufacture to machine industry, we can see a continuous trend towards greater rationalization, the progressive elimination of the qualitative human and individual attributes of the worker. On the one hand, the process of labor is progressively broken down to abstract, rational, specialized operations so that the worker loses contact with the finished product and his work is reduced to the mechanical repetition of a specialized set of actions. On the other hand, the period of time necessary for work to be accomplished, which forms the basis of rational calculation, is converted as mechanization and rationalization are intensified from a merely empirical average figure to an objectively calculable work stint that confronts the worker as a fixed and established reality. With the modern psychological analysis of the work process in Taylorism, this rational mechanization extends right into the worker's soul. Even his psychological attributes are separated from his total personality and placed in opposition to it so as to facilitate their integration into specialized rational systems and their reduction to statistically viable concepts. So essentially, this is Lukács's, again, fairly dense interpretation of Marx's idea of the commodity. This idea that, again, you strip away the qualitative aspects of things, you strip away what makes something unique and real, and reduce everything to this kind of, abstract, quantitative calculation of things. He also says, and this is one of the more, confusing passages, certainly. He says, what does he say here? Thus, time sheds its qualitative variable flowing nature. It freezes into an exactly delimited, quantifiable continuum filled with quantifiable things. The reified, mechanically objectified performance of the worker, wholly separated from his total human personality. In short, it becomes space. So this idea that time becomes space, very, perplexing idea. But again, if you follow what he's saying here, time having a qualitative aspect to it, time being, what you're doing in a spontaneous way versus what what you can calculate that a person can produce in a certain amount of time. So if you can figure out, how long it will take somebody to like fill up a warehouse filled with goods or something like that. That's essentially what he means by time becomes space. Time is reduced to the amount of time it takes to occupy a physical space or the time it creates to produce something. And it sort of loses, again, as he says, his, variable nature. In this environment where time is transformed into abstract, exactly measurable physical space, an environment at once the cause and effect of the scientifically and mechanically fragmented, specialized production of the object of labor, the subjects of labor must likewise be rationally fragmented. On the one hand, the objectification of their labor power into something opposed to their total personality, a process already accomplished with the sale of that labor power as a commodity, is now made into the permanent, ineluctable reality of their daily life. Hereto, the personality could do no more than look on helplessly while its own existence is reduced to an isolated particle and fed into an alien system. On the one hand, the mechanical disintegration of the process of production into its components, it also destroys those bonds that had bound the individuals to a community in the days when production was still organic. In this respect, too, mechanization makes of them isolated abstract atoms whose work no longer brings them together directly and organically. It becomes mediated to an increasing extent exclusively by the abstract laws of the mechanism which imprisons them. So again, also elaborating on this idea of the commodity form. Again, the stripping away of the qualitative aspects and the reduction of everything to the quantitative. All right, this might be the last passage I get to read out. But while this process is still incomplete, the methods used to abstract surplus labor are, it is true, more obviously brutal than in the later, more highly developed phase, but the process of reification of work and hence also of the consciousness of the worker is much less advanced. So he's talking about in an earlier phase where people are just, worked brutally to death, including, slavery, which is not necessarily the same thing as capitalism, but certainly plays a role in the genesis and creation of capitalism. But he's also obviously talking about the extremely brutal, factory conditions of the 19th century. Again, this is now, in the early 20th century. Yeah, Kyle, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I know it's we're almost done, but
Sorry.
I just wanted to say that like there's a pretty big contrast between what Marx was talking when you're talking about time and what Hegel what like philosophers describe as what time is, and it's kind of like it's like we've butchered reality. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Lukács is very much influenced by Hegel, and it's it's kind of a shame I haven't spent more time talking about Hegel because he does obviously factor in here. Marx talks about Hegel, Lukács talks about Hegel. In fact, all the other thinkers that what we talk about in this class pretty much talk about Hegel. So I'm sure if I haven't talked about him enough now, I will so certainly in the future. I think for the Marx portion of the class, I did have a slide about Hegel, but I didn't really get a chance to cover it in class. But yeah, I mean these concepts of time and space certainly come out of philosophy. Kant talks about it, who's a little bit before Hegel. Hegel talks about it as well. So Lukács is very much, sort of picking up Hegelian ideas, as did Marx, and sort of giving his own sort of take and interpretation of it.
Oh yeah, I was just drawing the comparison to like what time has become in a capitalist society, like how we view it rather than what it really is metaphysically.
Yeah,
in a metaphysical sense. So we don't even most people don't understand what it is metaphysically because they just have to work 8 hours to, I don't know.
Yeah. Sure. And again, back then it was 12 hours a day in many cases. So he says reification requires that a society should learn to satisfy all its needs in terms of commodity exchange. And again, this is a point that some people have talked about also already, right? Is that this idea of consumerism takes hold of everything. So I'm running out of time here, but again, essentially that's what Lukács is like talking about here, is that the process of producing commodities introduces this quantification of everything, of people, of institutions within a society, family life, education. How much is education geared towards quantifying everything? Think of STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. Think of the de-emphasis on arts and humanities. I mean, that very much plays a part here. Religion. I mean, I would think that, probably the reason why a lot of people do turn towards religion is because to them, at least, it represents something outside of this reifying process, this thingification of everything, this quantification of everything. It's something where there is a little bit of a non-materialist aspect to things. I don't think it's necessarily a good way to go, but you could at least understand why people sort of seek that out, because it sort of gives them an oasis from this sort of quantifiable world that they exist in most of the time. But what he's talking about here is that it extends from there. And again, as some people I'm glad to see have already pointed out, extends even into the consciousness of the worker, that the worker's mind essentially becomes thingified, and they sort of lose their ability to relate to people as other people. They relate to other people as objects, which again is something else that Marx talks about, that they learn to, again, satisfy their needs rather than in real human relationships, through commodities, through buying shit, that they don't need because they think it's going to make them happy. Unfortunately, I guess I have to end things here. We're out of time, unfortunately. Again, I'll put up the slideshow. I did put up the one for Marx already last week. Obviously, you can see it under the class modules. I'll put this one up as well. I'll put up the recording from the lecture as well. Are there any questions for me before we wrap things up? Okay. All right. So take care, everyone, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you so much. Have a good week.
Take care. Bye-bye.